Subjective. Interesting word, isn't it? The official definition of subjective reads like this: based on or influenced by personal feelings, taste, or opinions. So working off of that definition, this would make art, all of art, every single genre, every single subset, entirely subjective. And for the most part, that's true. However, sometimes a book, film, or song comes along that is just absolutely undeniable. Something that is just so damn good, nearly everyone can recognize it. Now, to be fair, this doesn't happen often, especially in the genre of horror. However, I think the video that we're going to be discussing today may just be one of those rare instances. So if you're a true horror fan, then I think you'll love it. Or maybe you won't, who knows. I guess we'll see. So sit back, relax, and let's get into it. The video that we'll be discussing today falls firmly into the somehow still underrated genre of Japanese horror. This specific genre tends to focus on building tension through psychological horror and the supernatural, especially involving ghosts. The origins of Japanese horror can be traced all the way back to the Edo period, and was known as Kaiden at the time, which, when translated, literally means strange story. Following the catastrophic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War, Japanese horror would boom at the cinema, often featuring vengeful spirits and monsters that had been mutated by radiation, which culminated with the release of the iconic Godzilla in 1954. However, it wouldn't be until the post-war era that horror really rose to prominence within Japan. Directed by Kaneto Shindo, Unibaba was one of the first major Japanese horror films to be released in cinemas. Similar to other early films from this period, many elements of the plot were largely drawn from traditional theater. Today, the film is labeled as a historical horror drama, wherein a woman and her mother-in-law must fight for survival during a vicious civil war. At the time, the film was heavily praised, in particular for its special effects. The director himself would even reveal that the makeup that was used during the famous unmasking scene was inspired by actual real-life mutilated victims of the atomic bombings. And so, this all goes to show that Japan has a long history of incorporating its own national tragedies and disasters into its media, especially within the horror genre. And over the long decades, Japan has continued to create and release some absolutely classic horror films. I mean, most of these are pure bangers, folks. Battle Royale was released in the year 2000, and although not a traditional horror film, it remains a cornerstone of Japanese cinema to this very day. And only 3 years after that, One Missed Call would be released, a film that successfully tapped into that era's burgeoning cell phone culture. Or how about Audition? This film in particular gave me plenty of nightmares as a child. Suffice it to say, Japanese horror is absolutely stacked with classics, and I believe that the video that we'll be discussing today is yet another entry into that long line of tradition. Before we can talk about the video that brought us all here, we first have to talk about a different video, an earlier video. Username 666 was first posted to YouTube 17 years ago, and in all of that time it has gone on to garner a staggering 20 million views. The video was uploaded by a channel called Nana825763, otherwise known as PiroPito. However, this project would become far more than a simple YouTube video. In fact, the video itself was so well made and convincing that it spawned its own creepypasta and internet hoax. For those that don't know, a creepypasta refers to a genre of horror fiction, often short and user-generated, that is copied and pasted around the internet. These stories and videos are usually presented as paranormal legends, urban myths, or personal accounts which are intended to frighten and unsettle the reader or viewer. In fact, the term creepypasta itself is simply a blend of the words copy and paste, which reflects how the stories and videos are commonly circulated online, and username 666 was the very definition of a creepypasta. Once posted, the video and hoax took on a life of its own, ultimately becoming one of the internet's earliest urban legends. Suffice it to say, I could do an entire video on just username 666 if I so wanted, and perhaps I will one day. But as for what you need to know in the context of this video, username 666 established Nana as a very interesting creator, one who certainly wasn't afraid to push the bounds of the medium. The premise of the video shows what apparently happens when someone searches for the username 666 on YouTube and then proceeds to refresh the page multiple times. In the years since its initial publication, much discussion has taken place regarding its content and authenticity, leading to many rumors and recreation in the years following, which only added to the original video's overall legend and mystique. Now, this might be a bit out of left field, but if we look at Nana825763 in the context of Christopher Nolan, my personal favorite director, then username 666 was his Batman Begins, which means his Dark Knight was just around the corner. On the 16th of the year 2016, a video of a house tour from the great nation of Japan was uploaded to YouTube. Now, just this simple fact in and of itself is fairly unremarkable. After all, a literal shit ton of house tour videos reside deep within the rotten, festering bowels of this platform. However, there was something just different about this particular one. The video itself was titled My House Walkthrough. A rather innocuous name perhaps, but compared to your everyday run-of-the-mill house tours, this video was darker, stranger, and overall far more unsettling. However, despite all appearances to the contrary, the description for My House Walkthrough insists that it's, quote, not a horror video. But as I'm sure that you can manage to glean from the title of my video, this description was untrue, and it was in fact a horror video. Plus truly terrifying horror at that. Now you may ask yourself, just why is this random video seemingly so good at scaring people? Well, I believe that the answer to that question is really twofold, with one answer being the video's excellent building of nearly unbearable tension throughout its runtime, and the other reason being its deep story. You see, at its very core, My House Walkthrough is not a house tour. It isn't a creepypasta or even an urban legend for that matter. In reality, it's a ghost story. Now, My House Walkthrough isn't as straightforward of a ghost story as something like Ring You is, for example, but that is still how I view it nonetheless. Indeed, to truly understand this video, one must strive to decode it to the best of their own abilities. However, if you do look deep enough, you'll find that the story is rich, haunting, and full of tragedy. And if you're more interested in what the making of such a project looks like, then you're in luck there as well, as just a few months after the initial publication of the video, PiroPito, aka Nana, released the making of, and I highly recommend giving that a watch. Trust me, it's fascinating stuff. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into who PiroPito, the creator of these projects, is in reality, because I don't believe it's necessary for understanding the video. Although, to be frank, it's also because there just isn't that much known about the man. Over the years, he's hardly made any information about himself public. In fact, as far as I know, he's never even done a face reveal. Instead, he uses a photograph of a small child as his profile photo, although whether this is actually Nana himself during his youth remains to be seen. Nana apparently resides within the Kanagawa Prefecture, which lies to the south of Tokyo, and he's been self-producing his own videos since the year 2000. For a while there, PiroPito did have his own website, but it was hosted at GeoCities, which went defunct in the year 2019. One distinction about Nana's work that I think needs to be made here is that while it's incredibly story-driven, it isn't necessarily plot-driven. And precisely because it isn't plot-driven, because it doesn't spell out every single little thing to the viewer, it actually challenges them to put it all together themselves. And so, with all that being said, let's do our best to break down the plot to My House Walkthrough. First, I need to point out that My House Walkthrough clocks in much longer than your average Nana video. Most of his videos are only 3 to 4 minutes in length, whereas My House Walkthrough is 12. Shot from a first-person perspective, the video takes the form of, as the title might suggest, a walkthrough of a man's house. The house is a traditional Japanese home, with tatami mats and shoji walls found throughout. But alas, it's obvious from the get-go that all is not well within this dark abode. The video begins in a bedroom, with the narrator stating, "The sound of the wind woke me up in the middle of the night." Now, we don't actually hear these words being spoken. In fact, there is no spoken language to be heard throughout the entirety of the video. Only subtitles. And through this white text, we find out more about the other rooms of the home. A typhoon is in Japan, the narrator's text explains. Perhaps this is why the house appears so dark, dank, and damp. The narrator then begins to take us along with him for a tour of the home. Initially, we see a bedroom, and the narrator describes how, quote, "the tatami mats are terribly damaged." As the tour proceeds, we see a hallway that is described as the longest, as well as a so-called Hina doll room, which contains an altar and portraits of family ancestors. Eventually, we come to another hallway, and yet another doll room, that the narrator mentions was, quote, "closed up by my grandfather." We see more photographs and portraits before reaching another hallway and a bathroom. I hear a sutra, the narrator states, with a sutra being a religious Buddhist text. My grandfather is always listening to sutra from the radio, he informs us. And when he pans up to show us the ceiling, he says, "The walls peel away from the ceiling when it rains." Ominous stuff. Then, once again, this is the longest hallway in my house. This is the first time that we receive a repetition of something that was already said, and this is followed by, "a typhoon is in Japan," another repetition. When I open this Fusuma sliding door, there is another hallway, except there isn't. What lies beyond that Fusuma sliding door is the same hallway that we've already seen. But wait, how could that be? Something's not right here. After all, we traveled through a sliding door, walked down a hallway, turned left, made our way down another hallway, before moving through yet another Fusuma sliding door. So you see the problem here. That's an L-shaped circuit, and one not long enough to have us return from where we started. And yet here we find ourselves, right back at the beginning. So right on cue, we begin a second walkthrough of the house. During this circuit, we hear all the same things that we heard the first time around, although there are a couple of new additions. We get a view of a so-called dress room and the grandmother's bedroom, although we do not actually go inside of either. The narrator informs us that both rooms were closed up by his grandfather sometime in the past, and once again we arrive back at the end of the hallway. The narrator states, "When I open this Fusuma sliding door, there is another hallway." And that's true, of course, except it's the same hallway. All in all, we end up making 8 full circuits through the interior of this impossible home. Within each and every lap, we see new rooms, and sometimes even enter rooms that we've seen before. Within the dress room, we see gowns that belong to the grandmother of the narrator, all sporting holes eaten by insects, which have, quote, turned black like bloodstains. My grandmother is not here, the narrator informs us. During each lap through the house, the repetition of phrases that we've already heard only grows more and more frequent. But not everything is the exact same. As we continue to walk, the house begins to change. It grows wetter, more damp. In fact, sections of it seem to be covered in some kind of living tissue. And the color red is everywhere, smeared upon the ceiling, oozing along the walls, tinting the whole world a raw, bloody shade. And the new circuit always begins after the narrator has slid open that sliding Fusuma door. During this circuit, though, something changes. As we venture into the grandmother's bedroom yet again, the narrator tells us that grandmother is here. And on the bed, there appears to be a human body. A body that's been mummified within the same exact tissue material that we've witnessed creeping all over the corners of this house. Within the bathroom, there is now a doll in the sink and standing red water on the floor. And there appears to be a body in the bathtub. Grandfather is here, the narrator tells us. The sound of the wind woke me up. On our next trip through the house, we see that it's been almost entirely overtaken by the tissue-like substance. The similar phrases begin to repeat themselves until we get to some brand new dialogue. The ceiling has rotted and fallen away, the narrator says. There are rats' nests above the ceiling. The holes eaten by insects have turned black like bloodstains. No one has been in this room in a very long time. And finally, we end back in the narrator's room. This is my room, he says. A typhoon is in Japan. And right before the screen fades to black, we see the phrase, sweet dreams. Now let's break down what we think it all means. So, did you find the video scary? Perhaps you did, perhaps you didn't. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it seems to be a very subjective thing. I, however, found it terrifying. Now, for a video that doesn't really tell us much about itself, there are still quite a few details that we can uncover about the situation from watching it critically and carefully. First, this is an old home. The architecture is obviously traditional, and I'm guessing that this house has probably been in the family for generations. Second, take note of the inclement weather. It's probably another clue as to what's really going on here. And third, the time period that this is all taking place in is at least a few years removed from the end of World War II. But what I would argue is the most important detail is the phrase that is spoken at least 4 separate times. A typhoon is in Japan. Being an island nation within the Northwest Pacific Ocean, Japan is quite prone to typhoons. Typhoons consist of, quote, rotating, organized systems of clouds and thunderstorms which originate over tropical or subtropical waters. Within Japan, typhoon season typically consists of the months May through October. However, the peak months consist of August and September. Now, if we take a look at Japanese history, we can see that the year 1959 brought with it one of the single most destructive typhoons ever recorded. Referred to as Typhoon Vera, the storm hit the region of Honshu on September 26th and absolutely devastated the nation. The ferocious winds of this storm reached a mind-boggling 306 kilometers or 190 miles per hour. 5,000 people would tragically lose their lives during this storm, and nearly 39,000 would go missing. Even today, Japan is still frequently besieged by typhoons. With these details as our background, the video begins to take on a whole different meaning. You start to see it as a story of a family caught in the full fury of a raging tempest. A story of a family who died in that typhoon, perhaps having drowned, or maybe they were trapped inside and perished later from starvation. The story of a family who is still trapped there to this very day, stuck within their once beloved home, still cycling through their final night on repeat. This video is like a Groundhog's Day from hell. This is a family of ghosts, still existing within the confines of a haunted house. Personally, I've never found slasher movies, torture porn, or monster movies to be very scary. But a ghost story? I find that terrifying. And the reason why can be summed up in 2 little words: existential dread. And that's all I feel while watching this video. What happens after we die? Where do we go? Do we continue on in some form, or do we simply cease to exist? These are the type of questions that haunt me at night. Another factor I need to mention is the video's excellent building of nearly unbearable tension. As you're watching, every single time that Fusuma door slides open, your gut clenches with dread. You're certain that this time there's going to be something there. Something terrifying. A jump scare that simply never arrives. Personally, I love this. I mean, horror is chock full of cheap gotcha scares, and there's nothing cheap about this video. It truly earns your fear. Now, one of the reasons that we can place the time era within which this video takes place is simply the makeup of the family itself. Clearly, there's a distinct generational divide going on here. During the Second World War, at least 123,000 children were orphaned within Japan. Perhaps this explains why the narrator was living with his grandparents instead of his parents. However, there are plenty of details that don't support this theory. For instance, it isn't very likely that a young man from 1959 would have access to the type of camera used in this video, or the internet for that matter. So, in reality, could this be the tragic tale of a much more recent typhoon? Of course it could. Anything's possible. And that's where that subjectivity comes back into play. At the end of the day, though, the story of My House Walkthrough is whatever you think that it is. And for me, at least, that's one terrifying thought.